The HR Stories podcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories helps businesses and nonprofits better manage the employee experience, providing the tools, training, and resources they need to take their organization to the next level. Each week on the HR Stories podcast, management and HR consultants John Thalheimer and Chuck Smickian dive into the stories that matter to small business owners, nonprofit leaders, and HR professionals. We continue to be amazed at how companies allow poor decision-making, lack of knowledge, or in some cases, hubris to cause harm to their organizations. Each week, we discuss stories where companies must pay large fines, lose great talents, and even stain their reputation within the community. And then we tell you how to avoid the same fate. Welcome to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story. In today's episode, we will be discussing pizzas, unions, and the National Labor Relations Board. And before you say, oh, union stuff, remember there's a lot of policies of the National Labor Relations Act that impact non-union houses as well. But first, Here's what's happening in the HR news. Good morning, Chuck.
Good morning. It's funny you used the term house, right? And I thought, house? What are you talking about? Non-union houses. And then I realized you're a theater person. You're a theater background. It's called the house, right?
Right. So, the house. Yeah. Well, always. Yeah. I mean, when I was in theater, sometimes you worked in union houses and sometimes you worked in non-union houses, depending on where you were, right? And so I was in the theatrical union for a bit of my career, and then I moved out of that. And so then I worked in non-union houses. And there's, benefits for both, right? And so kind of had some kind of perspective on that. So I'm excited for this story to see how this plays out. There's news we're going to get into about the unions. And so I don't know if you want to dive into that, because that's recent, that's hot. We should probably talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So this was huge news from the National Labor Relations Board. It came out as a court case. And in summary, this is going to affect every company really in the country in regards to trying to maybe keep unions out or remain union free. But it was a huge win for unions. A couple of years ago, John, there was something that was being pushed and I've brought this up before. This is not a political discussion, but it's a fact. Every time there's a different administration, Republicans or Democrats, and they nominate different people to different boards, EEOC and the National Labor Relations Board, things change. And philosophies change. And a couple of years ago, there was something called card check that was being pushed through. That got shot down, but that was where if you had employees that signed these union cards saying they wanted to be a union, if you got 50% plus one, you automatically got a union. Well, that was kind of shot down. It was not very popular, but this new ruling, and I have to tell you, this is something every employer needs to know right now.
Oh yeah, totally agree.
It was a lawsuit with a group called CEMEX, which is a construction supply group, right? They make cement and stuff. So basically, the ruling is now, if your employees sign union cards or a petition to say, hey, we want to have a union represent us. If you have a majority, and a majority is defined as 50% plus one, and they come to you as a company, you have two choices. Now, it used to be, okay, let's do a union campaign and that sort of thing. But now and you have two choices. The first choice is recognize the union. Like the 50% plus one come to you, they say, we want a union, let's recognize the union. And you do it, you just go forward. Or you say, you know what? I don't want a union, I want an election, because we have other employees that didn't sign this. So if you choose that option and you file a petition saying, I want to have a full-blown, election, then this is where the ruling gets kind of murky, not murky, but gets interesting. The new ruling is that if you do decide to pick the election option, if you in that back and forth commit any type of what they call a violation or an unfair labor practice, even inadvertently, then you automatically get the union. And
Wow.
that's scary to a lot
Yeah.
of folks. And so there's going to have to be a lot of education on, typically when these things happen, the union has meetings, come join us. The employer has meetings, come join us. Come join us. Don't sign the union, that sort of thing. And the rules are getting so tight that if an employer says or does one wrong thing and it becomes a labor violation, unfair practice, then it's like default. You got the union no matter what. And
Wow.
it's a big deal.
I think that'll be interesting because if that kind of thing happens, I think, right, there could be not employees that don't want the unions. And I think they're going to have a case to be like, wait a minute, we don't want a union. And how, just because this one thing happened, we didn't have a chance to voice our concerns and all that kind of stuff. So it will play out in courts for sure.
It will.
But it's going to be interesting. And I think, and I know you talk about this, and we're going to dive a little bit into this story today, but I think if you don't want unions at any cost, you need to start your branding. You need to start talking about that day one with your employees to talk about the benefits of not working in a union and what all that kind of stuff is. You can't ignore it at this point. We'll wait till that happens because correct me if I'm wrong, Chuck, but the election has to be in like 2 weeks or something, right? I mean, it's pretty quick.
Yeah, they don't let you drag it out, and I can't speak to the specifics right now, but it has to be within a couple of weeks. And I have to tell you, there are some states that are putting laws in place saying that companies can't do those mandatory meetings anymore. And that's been and that's a whole other subject for a whole other HR Stories podcast. But I will tell you that we've been doing some workshops to our listeners. I want to make sure they know that we just completed the how to build a retention model workshop, and that's available for download. We've got a number of other workshops coming up, and we'll put the link below just to kind of keep you compliant and build a better employee relations situation and all kind of great workshops from the team at HR Stories. That's John and I.
Yeah, the team. Well, we have Samantha, we have Kate, Matt. I consider them all part of our team. Right? Lots of people helping us out, making sure this all comes together as a team. No, I love that. And I love that we're going to be diving into unions as part of our major story today, because I think what we're going to hear in this story is, what do I need to do even if I'm not unionized, right? And so what do I need to do to make sure that we're doing that there? So one of the things that I read in the newspaper, and I found this very interesting. So Smuckers, right? We know Smuckers, right? The jam company. And yeah, I see it on the face, right? You're doing a little PB&J this afternoon.
Yeah.
What I found fascinating was they were trying to figure out how to deal with this return to work, right? And so during COVID, they sent all their employees away, and now they're like, okay, we want you to come back in. And so a lot of companies now are doing what they call hybrid weeks, where you need to be in the office 2, 3, maybe 4 times a week and doing that. Well, Smuckers has taken a different approach, which I think is a fascinating, I'm not going to say out of the box, because it's not that different, but it helps us all kind of think about, okay, if I have remote workers and if I have that option, how do I then bring them back into the office and not have them fight it and do all that kind of stuff? So what they did is, instead of saying, okay, you need to be in the office 2 times every week, they said, we're going to have 22 core weeks, they call them, that you need to be in the office. And at first there was a little pushback on this, but I think it's 2 weeks every month, except for, I want to say July and August and December. And then it's 1, right? And so that's it. That's all when you need to be in the office. And so what they've been doing is leaders and managers have increased the employee activity, team building activity. So, there'll be dinners out. There'll be big discussion meetings when everyone is in the office. And so their participation rate is up to like 85%, which is pretty good,
Wonderful.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
have that.
It's such a huge deal. I'm reading articles every day about companies that are reversing course and saying, come back to the office. It's causing
Yeah.
employees consternation. Some employees are leaving. Amazon was just in the news because they were like, hey, work anywhere you want. And now people have moved. And now they're saying, oh, well, you know what? There are 5 regional locations. We need you to move near one of those regional locations. Now they're offering relocation and all that stuff, but there are people that just don't want to do that and kind of let the genie out of the bottle. But I love that core, that core work weeks type of thing. So that's a neat little model. Sounds
Yeah,
sweet.
I think it's right. I think it's something to be thinking about is in terms of what is the best thing for your employee culture in terms of that. Because we know there's been a lot of studies that people are more productive at home, right? And so there's a lot of that. But we also know collaboration goes down when people are working remote, right? And so how do we balance those two things to have that efficiency and creating that and having team building? I just love that they thought differently about it. I think that's my sort of like, oh, that's different. I didn't even think about doing that, right? So there may be other options in there as well.
That's a great story in the news. Good one. What else you got, John?
I got one other story, and this one is something that everyone needs to pay attention to because we do not want to be this business owner, right? We don't want to be this business owner. This business owner is awaiting trial for manslaughter charges. And so what happened was they were a residential plumbing organization. And so they dig trenches to put in the plumbing into residential houses. And one of those trenches collapsed, killing I think 23, 27-year-old individual in that. And so the problem was, yes, terrible thing happens, that kind of stuff. But the owner had been cited by OSHA before this event happened numerous times for not properly digging trenches and protecting their employees. And so this was all cited. And so when this accident happened, there's a lawsuit now. And he's going to be he's charged for manslaughter. I mean, again, we still got to go through the process and that kind of stuff. Company's gone, right? The company is now defunct. So I just think like those are the things like, it's just a business. I'm only in a business. I'm not going to worry about it. It's never going to impact me. It's just going to be the business, right? As an owner, it's just the business. They'll go sue the business. It's not me. In this case, the owner, because the owner made the decision like, we're not going to follow that OSHA recommendation. It was not a recommendation, right? It was like, this is what you need to do to protect your employees. That's what gets you in trouble. Right. And so, yes, it's a pain when OSHA comes and says you're doing it wrong, but you have to listen to them and say, all right, that's what we're going to do going forward. This is the right way to do it. And, again, they didn't have the right supervision, lots of issues in there, but I just wanted to make sure that people understood these are the things that happen. And we have to be paying attention to them for sure. So.
Yeah, John, when it comes to OSHA, it's the willful violations that are going to get your company in deep, hot water. And it's not just going to stop with, here's a citation for the company, like you said, but who's ultimately responsible, especially if there's a death or an amputation or a loss of an eye. Yeah. They're going to go all the way to the top. And there have been a number of stories that I think I've shared in previous podcasts, and if not, it sounds like it could be, but where owners have refused to do safety things, provide safety equipment, gloves, all kind of training, and they've actually refused, even though they've been told. And people lose hands and fingers and baler machines. And when that happens, well, someone's got to pay the piper, and this is a great example of that.
Yeah, I mean, again, right? I mean, the tragedy is because they didn't, someone died, right? It wasn't like, we broke a pipe or we did something small. Somebody died because they were willfully negligent in this practice, right? And so, again, I don't think our listeners are going to do that. But we have to reinforce it. We always want to make sure that you guys are paying attention to that. So I think that's kind of really important to do and make sure. So,
Yeah. Well, today's story, John, deals
yeah.
with listening. It's listening, maybe not so much to OSHA, although there are some safety and OSHA related type things here that could have happened. But I will tell you that today's story deals with listening to your employees.
Right.
So it's all about, once again, listening to your employees. If you want to stay in business and be profitable, listen to the government agencies, listen. So today we're going to deal with something that we've not touched on a whole lot, although we've mentioned a little times, and that is unions. And
okay. Talk a little about unions.
Yeah. But, we're going to talk a little bit about, we're also going to talk, about employee rights, what employers should be doing and should not be doing, and how sometimes, and I use the term bravado, ego, maybe, but you've used the term hubris, when employers may be aware of the law or not aware of the law, but their hubris takes them in a whole other direction. And basically today we're talking about not being aware of the law and saying things to your employees that can get you into a whole lot of hot water.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, think about the last two episodes that we've been dealing, right? We were talking about the 20 different rights employees have. And so sometimes companies aren't aware of them, and then they make more apparent. So they don't fall into those trampling those rights, right? And so we have to be aware of what those rights are and what we're doing, right? And so we also wanted to make sure employees, and of course HR professionals and managers listen to our show, remind themselves that employees have these rights.
Yeah. And exactly. And one of the things we really did not dig into, but it bears a whole lot, is an episode regarding the National Labor Relations Act and what's known as Section 7 and Section 8 when it comes to protected employee concerted activities, and how and what is protected and what happens if there are violations.
I think I know where you're going, but give me an example. Give me more information on that.
Sure. So over the years, we've talked about, and especially my early career, and I know you remember this too, many times in the employee handbooks, there was a clause in there saying employees cannot discuss salary or their pay rate with others. And if you do, you will be subject to discipline up to and including termination. Do you remember those clauses?
And I still there was an example that came out about 2 years ago where this manager posted in the break room, subordinates, you cannot talk about or listen to conversations about salary, right? And there was this whole big thing about it. But what I love about that story was the employees responded and put up their own memo, and they said something about, you need to know Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act. And they signed it. Everyone put their employee their salary level in there, right? And so,
my gosh,
we can have that conversation.
Wow, that's a cool story. So, over the years, we've come to realize, as you brought up, that and through several legal cases and reminders from the National Labor Relations Board, and of course all kind of employment attorneys, that it is an illegal statement to put that in the handbook. Obviously, putting it up in the break room, and to hold employees to that and discipline them for exercising their rights. And employees are getting smarter because they have access now to a lot of tools and information they never did in the past.
Yeah, and I think that is the thing that, going back in our history, employees do now have access. There's people doing podcasts about employee rights at the HR Stories podcast, right? And it was so funny. So, Chuck, you and I are traveling today, right? Both of us, you're in North Carolina, I'm up in New Hampshire. And so I checked into the hotel last night and I said, look, I need to
extend checkout. Can I have a late checkout? And I'm like, and we're just chatting. And she goes, oh, why? And I'm like, well, I have to record my podcast tomorrow. And so I said, oh, so we talked about what the podcast was about. And I said, oh yeah, we just did these episodes about employee rights. And she goes, oh, I need to listen to that.
I love that.
Right.
Well,
So again, right, not following these things can get companies in hot water, right? And so they need to know what they are.
Yeah, exactly. And today's main story that we're going to get to in just a minute, I know there's been a lot of buildup here, but it deals with that exact subject. Although there are some twists and some turns and a few learning points. And of course, one of my favorite things, pizza.
Pizza perfecto. Love pizza, but looking forward to see how you're going to wrap all that into the HR story. What do you think about taking a break now before we get into the story?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You've been listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there's a lesson in every story. Hello, listeners. I have some questions for you. Do you find yourself struggling with HR and employment issues? Are you afraid you could make the wrong employment decision that will cost your company thousands or even millions of dollars? Maybe you're new to the world of HR, or you've been in HR for a while and you just wish you had one resource, a guide to help you get HR right. Well, I've got good news for you. The team at HR Stories is excited to announce a new comprehensive resource, the Ultimate Book of HR Checklists. We created the Ultimate Book of HR Checklists as a simple, step-by-step resource guide packed with 70 downloadable checklists and other resources that help small businesses and organizations get human resources right. Even with very little HR or management experience, you can get instant results with concise, practical steps for addressing many of your tough employment issues. Do not miss out. Go to hrchecklist.com to learn more. That's hrchecklists with an S.com to learn more. And as always, thanks for listening to the HR Stories podcast, where the lesson is always in the story.
Welcome back to the HR Stories podcast. Myself and Chuck have been talking about pizza, and we've been talking about unions. Now, Chuck's going to tell us how those two things relate.
Well, it all begins, John, in the town of Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburg, PA. You see, I'm from the town right next to Mount Lebanon. For our local listeners, called Scott Township. I would go through Mount Lebanon. I would shop in Mount Lebanon. I'd eat in Mount Lebanon. I had friends that lived in Mount Lebanon. In fact, even as a little kid, up until 5 or 6 years old, my parents, we lived in Mount Lebanon, and then we moved a mile away. So I'm very familiar with this area, and I'm familiar with the pizza place and restaurant that this story takes place in. It's called Beto's Pizza. It's been there for 37 years. It's one of my favorite pizza places, and it's an icon amongst the Pittsburgh pizza restaurant scene. So there you go, John. That's how we wrap pizza into this story.
I love that. I love that you have that connection, that personal connection. I think that'll bring it out for the listeners. You can help us taste the pizza, but I also want to know, well, wait, what's this about unions? I want to know more. Could dive into that for me.
Sure. So to just give our listeners a visual reference, Beto's Pizza is in a small little boutique shopping area. And it used to be just a pizza place. Then they've broadened out to a delicatessen and a restaurant. So they've got a pizza, takeout, a pizza restaurant, and then they have a full service restaurant and a bar they built out as they've expanded. And over the 37 years.
Sounds like a team building opportunity, Chuck.
Yeah, there you go. So this case comes out of a complaint that was issued in November of 2021. The complainant was an employee named Andrew Yoho, and he filed this on July 6, 2021. You see, Andrew says on July 1st, a few days earlier, owner named Frank Betolato, okay, Beto's Pizza Betolato.
I got that. Nice.
terminated him due to his protected concerted activities by threatening him and telling him that employees did not have the right to complain about wages, hours, and conditions. This is what Andrew's saying. Now we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. So to tell you how it ends up in this final confrontation on July 1st, we need to go back in time. Back in time.
All right. How far are we going back?
We're going back just a couple of days, actually. So Andrew Yoho, whose nickname was Rue for some reason, but that was part of the court case. I don't know why. I thought I'd share that. Began to work. Yeah, listeners, we dig into these things. So he began as a cook in February of 2021, and he had experience as a pizza maker. And his primary duty was working the pizza station, but he made salads, sandwiches, and took delivery orders by phone. According to the owner, and this is in the court documents, right? Frank Badaledo said he was a very good employee. And on average, there were 3 employees that worked in the kitchen. Working regularly with Yoho was a employee named Aiden Smith, Randy Bishop, and Scott Whitaker, as well as the kitchen manager, George Pritkus. Aiden Smith was also a pizza maker, and Bishop and Whitaker worked the grill, but they rotated. Now, there's a lot of names here, so I'll try and keep referencing back who they are as we move along. But for this story, it's important. Yeah, it's important to notice that Pritkus is a manager on the payroll records, and he functioned as a manager providing instructions.
Yeah, so when you say payroll records, you mean he was officially recognized by the company as a manager?
Yes, okay. He was. Apparently, though, he didn't have from what I'm reading this, he may not have had the title, but they were paying him more. And when the employees were all hired, the owner would point to Mr. Pritkus, George, and say, he's your boss. Okay. And so that's important as part of this story. But sometimes when he was not available, the kitchen staff considered a lady named Mariana Kane, and she was the head bartender in charge of the front part of the restaurant, and she was their direct supervisor when George Pritkus wasn't around. And Kane had the authority to decide what time the kitchen would stop prepping and preparing customers' pizza orders.
So why is that? Why are you going into those details in terms of like who is the boss and who's the supervisor and who has authority? Why is that important?
Yeah, so hold tight. Explanation will be forthcoming.
Hey, wait. You always get upset with me about making you wait for information. So maybe you can give me, and more importantly, our listeners, a clue of where you're going.
Sure. So, okay. How do I guess I'll just come right out and say it. It comes to a concept that you and I talk about quite frequently about in employment and payroll in our HR law classes, which we teach quite a few of. It's a concept called agents of the company. In other words, these 2 individuals as managers and as identified as such, they functioned as agents of the company. So if employees go to them and say something, maybe to complain about a working condition or to ask for something, or let's say these 2 people violate some sort of employment law or payroll law with their actions, they can be held liable. The company can be held liable and get hot water because these folks are considered agents of the company as identified by the owner saying they're in charge when I'm here or they're your boss.
Yeah, and I love that you said that because as you know, I'm traveling and I've been doing some employment law courses with HR folks. We had this discussion yesterday. So I was in a training course and we had HR directors in this course and we were really trying to dive into it. And we were talking about understanding that not only are they in their role as HR directors and managers, agent of the company, but the supervisors and managers are agents of the company, and they are working on behalf of the employer. And so if they are making decisions,
Yes.
those decisions are decided as, their employer decisions, right? And so that becomes really important. That concept of agents of the company is so important for not only us in HR, but also business owners and managers and leaders and supervisors need to understand. What we were talking about, Chuck? We were talking about going out after work to the cocktail park, right?
Okay.
And so we were talking about going to happy hour. And so one of the gentlemen was like, does that mean I just can't go out with my team and just have a drink? And we all kind of said, well, no, you probably shouldn't. But if you're going to do it and you start to feel uncomfortable, you should leave immediately. Because if you see something happen, maybe it's a sexual harassment thing, maybe you see somebody getting drunk, you're an agent of the company. And that you have that responsibility.
Absolutely. And that's why we tell managers, train your managers, train your supervisors, because they're the ones that are getting you in trouble. And folks, this is episode 48 of the HR Stories podcast. We've got 47 episodes of where managers did something wrong on behalf of the company and got the company in trouble. So anyways,
all right, let's not blame it all on managers, but
okay.
Right, a lot of it. I will say the majority of them, yes.
Sure. So picking up on the story, and I understand, remembering, like I said, all these names is tough, but Yoho, our original complainant, and then there were Smith, Bishop, and Whitaker, those are the cooks. They often talked about how understaffed they were and having to perform their work that was really outside their job duties, like dishwashing in particular. There's supposed to be a dishwasher, but no one was in that position. They talked amongst themselves about unsanitary conditions. And at times, Yoho and one or more of the employees would tell George Pritkus, the kitchen manager, that I'm using that term, by the way, that wasn't in the court documents. Right. But they would tell him that they needed a dishwasher. The volume of the work has increased. And Pritkus would respond that he would handle it. And so, as Aiden Smith, one of the other cooks, said in the court documents, the kitchen staff had sporadic conversations over a period of weeks, usually on the weekends when they were busy, about the need for a dishwasher, another cook on the grill, and they also raised sanitation issues with Pritkus. Yoho frequently spoke with him about food safety, such as the temperature of the meat, the handling of the meat, leaving food out too long. He also told Pritkus about the ceiling, leaking rainwater onto the grill, which at times drenched the cooks. And this is why, once again, Pritkus, an agent of the company, right? And so, according to Yoho, the biggest issue towards the end of his employment was the lack of plastic gloves, which he considered necessary when dealing with raw meat. And court documents shared, by the way, that 10 employees over, and I don't know the period of time, but over a period of time had discussed the need for gloves.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I just want to paint this picture, right? Because this may not necessarily mean in the back room, all the employees are in the little back room and they're in the closet talking about it. This could be conversations as they're working. Gosh, I wish there was more gloves. I wish I need all these things. I need oh gosh, this is, and yelling to the boss, we need more gloves. This is terrible. Have terrible working conditions, right? That's what we're talking about here. Not necessarily, hey, they're offsite at a conference room. Those things happen too. Typically that's when we're getting closer to unions, but it could be any of that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah. So we're seeing a pattern here where there's complaints to an agent of the company, a manager, and it seems like no one's listening. And according to the court testimony, the kitchen employees had discussed several times then about just walking out prior to June 29th, but they never did.
All right, so let's make this clear, right? The kitchen employees complained to the agent, right? The kitchen manager. Now, that wasn't the title, but that's how he was perceived in the workplace, both from the owner and the employees about their working conditions. So did the manager, the kitchen manager, Chris, did he do anything?
Yeah, well, overall, and this was a long court case document. So just to summarize, overall, he would tell them that he would talk to the owner about their situation, and that's usually where it would end.
So did the kitchen staff ever talk to the owners?
Actually, they did, and here's where our story continues. On June 29th, now remember, July 1st is where apparently the termination happened. July 6th, a few days later, is where the complaint was filed. But on June 29th, our pizza cooks, Yoho, Smith, and Whitaker, were scheduled to work starting at 11 a.m. And but the day before, the kitchen staff had run out of plastic gloves. So that morning, Yoho, acting without express authorization from the employees. In other words, they didn't say, "Hey, Andy, go do this." He just goes out
Right.
and he talks to owner Frank and said the kitchen staff needs gloves. Badalito says, "Why?" And Yoho says, "To handle raw meat." The owner says that he did not have to provide them gloves and that they should use their bare hands. When Yoho said that he wouldn't, Badalito became irate and just Yoho walked away, and that's kind of where it ended. But later,
So I'm assuming by irate, there was probably some words spoken in there.
yes,
Maybe.
and it doesn't go into that. Yeah, they don't go into that too much in the court documents, although they sure do a little later. But so later, they have a second conversation when Badalito was on his way out the back door of the kitchen that led to the alley. Raw chicken was still on the floor, but I don't understand that part. I don't know if it was
my
guess
was
on the floor.
Yeah, no, my guess was that it was in the containers, and the containers were on the floor. So
I hope. But Badalito says, "Hey, put that chicken away. Put that chicken away." And Yoho replies that he would not do it without gloves. And as he left, Badalito yells something to the effect that he did not need to provide gloves, and he told Yoho to use a plastic bag or bring in his own gloves. And he said, you kitchen employees are going through too many gloves, and it costs too much money to keep buying them. Yeah. So after Badalito leaves, Yoho, Smith, and Whitaker start talking amongst themselves again, how they need to be careful about washing their hands, touching raw meat. It was rough on their hands. And so there was a suggestion, hey, let's just go to the nearby pizza restaurant that wasn't part of this group, right? And see if they have any spare gloves. So Yoho goes out and he's able to get a handful of gloves. So later that evening, Badalito's not in the restaurant, and Mariana Kane, the head bartender, is solely in charge. Business was slow until about 4 or 5 o'clock. Dinner rush starts. It's very hot that day. Working in the kitchen, it was even harder. And the cooks started discussing the difficulty they're having with the shortage in staff, the possibility of walking out for these reasons, including the extreme heat.
So they start having conversations at this point, like, well, no one's listening to us. Maybe we need to do some type of action to get them to listen to us, right? I mean, they maybe not been using those words, but that's what was the thing of it. Right.
We've talked to George Pritkus, our manager. We've talked to the owner. And now this is becoming an unbearable situation in the kitchen. So Yoho, our original complainant, goes to Mariana Kane, the head bartender, and says, "Hey, can you close the kitchen early? We're not going to be able to fulfill all these orders." And she says there's no way she's going to do this. And he says, "Look, if you don't, the kitchen employees are going to walk out." And Yoho went back to the other cooks and asked if they wanted to all walk out together because they couldn't keep up with the orders. They all replied yes, and there was a lot of back and forth between the kitchen and the front, the manager. Ultimately, the kitchen was told to stay open, and two of the cooks, after a lot of discussion, punched out and left. The third cook, Mr. Whitaker, however, went out for a cigarette break, but afterwards goes back and goes back to work, did not punch out. And Beidolato testified that upon learning about the walkout, he personally came to the restaurant and assisted with filling the pizza orders.
Wow, that's kind of crazy. I mean, right now, all those things going on. And you see this in small businesses where there's a lot of personalities, a lot of things going on. But when you get to that place where you have 66% of your kitchen staff walking out, wow, totally intense.
Yeah, it actually was. There's a lot of back and forth.
So I'm trying to understand, how did this end up as a court case based on the National Labor Relations Act? I mean, walking off the job sounds like abandonment to me. Like, okay, you're gone, you left.
Correct. And John, as you often say, yes, maybe it depends, because we've terminated people. I've terminated people for walking off the job. And in this case, it really depends on a few circumstances. You see, the judge looked at the aftermath. Okay. In other words, what happened the next day on June 29th? Now, remember, Andrew Yoho, our original protagonist and complainant in this story, was terminated on July 1st and filed the court case on July 6th. So what happened in those few days and how the owner, Frank, dealt with this situation is why we are here talking about this today. So buckle on your seatbelt, because here comes the rest of the story.
And where there is a lesson in every story. All right, so I'm buckled in. I'm ready to go. I knew there was more. I knew you were withholding from us. I knew it.
Yeah. So the next day, Smith, who was one of the people that walked out, apologizes to Mariana Kane for the way that he had left. She says, "Hey, I accept your apology. Hey, I accept your apology." Okay, I shouldn't do it that way, but Italian restaurant, right? I accept your apology. And so he goes back to work. Later, he apologized to Beidolato, who says that his apology was accepted. So Smith doesn't lose his job or suffer any detrimental consequences.
Well, that sounds like a soft landing. Doesn't seem like I needed a seatbelt for that.
Well, you're right. But on July 1st, Andrew Yoho comes back. He's scheduled to work later that day, and he goes in a little early, goes in an hour early to talk to owner Frank Beidolato about the working conditions. Beidolato was in the kitchen when he arrived. No other employees specifically appointed Yoho to be their spokesperson, but he testified he did it on their behalf. And so he goes in and he pulls out from his pocket handwritten notes that of requests, not demands, as it was noted, but he wanted to keep their conversation congenial. And he mentioned Section 7 rights, protecting concerted protest, and the biggest issue was not having enough people in the kitchen and the need for a full-time dishwasher and a chef, preferably two.
Interesting. And so you may not know this, but did he get guidance from somebody to be like, oh, I want to talk about Section 7? Or did he just do that on his own? And you may not know, of course.
I don't know, but it sure does sound like he had a lawyer friend or an HR friend in between the time the walkout happened and then his next scheduled day. And I've seen that before. And just like you said, those folks put up a list of, oh, these are our rights, and we're going to put our salaries. So someone somewhere told him this, and he came with a written list. Hey, here's our requests. And he used the term requests, not demands. So it's very interesting, the verbiage. But you are correct. But get this. Beidolato responds, "You don't get to tell me how to run my business. Yoho then raised this issue of sanitation, to which Bettolato asked what he's referring to. Yoho says, well, the rain that's coming through the ceiling. Bettolato says, hey, that's been fixed. And in fact, guess what? You don't even work here anymore. Why are we even talking about this? Yoho's like, I still work here. I'm just concerned about the restaurant. Bettolato says, you quit, you walked out. And Yoho says he had walked out but not quit. So this is going back and forth, right? With Bettolato repeating, you quit, you walked out, and Yoho denying it.
Yeah, so now I'm the owner of the restaurant. Somebody walks out on me in the middle of a shift. I'm going to be considered it's a voluntary resignation. Now, I may have dealt with it differently than Bettolato did, but that's probably would have been my mentality. I would have been thinking that. But I also noticed earlier you said that the other employees who walked out did not lose their job. Am I right? That's what you said.
That's what I said. You are correct.
All right, so here's where I think I need to start fastening my seatbelt, putting on my safety gear, as it were.
Yeah. Yes. And so, and maybe your earplugs, because there was a little profanity here, although I'm not going to say the specific words because I don't know if Samantha can beep these things out, but we'll get the gist of it. Bettolato says, get out of the kitchen. Yoho says he would only leave if he was fired because he had protection and did not think Bettolato should fire him. Bettolato looked and, you know, apparently in the court documents, they used the term glared, okay? Glared at him and says, are you effing threatening me? Yoho says no. Bettolato takes several steps towards Yoho until he was only 1 or 2 inches away, and Yoho steps back, and Bettolato says, are you effing threatening me? Are you coming in here and effing threatening me? Get out. Get the F out of my kitchen. Okay, do we know what the word F is? Yoho offered to come back the next day if Bettolato would calm down. Bettolato said no because Yoho had quit and you need to get out of here. I actually understand from the documents, that they called the police. Apparently this exchange got to the point that someone called the police. So it got pretty intense.
Right. And so
there's your seatbelt moment.
Yeah. I mean, wow. I'm just thinking about, all right. So I'm assuming a witness called the police because they were concerned for Yoho's health or safety. Do we know?
I think they called the police because of Frank Bettolato's testimony said Yoho was threatening him and yelling at him. And so apparently someone on Bettolato, maybe Bettolato, whose daughter worked there, called the police. But at some point the police come. The bottom line, no one was arrested, but there were a lot of previous court rulings and precedents. And the judge in this case took those precedents and those rulings and ruled that Andrew Yoho ultimately had engaged in protected concerted activity before June 29th, on June 29th, and on July 1st when he met with Bettolato, and that the activities of a single employee in enlisting the support of fellow employees in mutual aid and protection is as much concerted activity as it is an ordinary group activity. And I know that's kind of a technical term there, but bottom line is the judge said, hey, you were talking, you engaged in protected activity to discuss your work conditions. You went to the powers that be, and you did this as a group. And because prior to you may get to this, and he was fired because of those activities. Mm-hmm. Right? Yes. Because that's why he was fired and the other person who walked off wasn't fired. Yes. And that was a big deal. The judge mentioned that too. It says, well, it seems like the person that actually came forward and actually was the messenger, that person actually got fired for being the messenger. Once again, the protected concerted activity. And the judge said that going to Pritkus, the manager, Frank Battalato, had knowledge of all these activities, even though they didn't talk to Frank Battalato directly about some of the other things.
Yeah, because, right, so we get into this, but right, and so the agent of the company, the kitchen manager was told and informed. We don't know if that information was passed on to the owner, but also they went directly to the owner and said, look, these conditions are bad. I'm going to come in. I'm walking off because of these conditions are so bad. I'm going to come back 2 days later and I'm going to say, look, you need these sanitation things. This is the request we have to work in this organization, in this kitchen. And then that person's fired and the other person's aren't. Wow. There's a lot of things going on in the story. So what's like the specific point here, I guess, is to better train your employers, really, and your managers and supervisors in employment law.
Yeah. And not only that, but the best way to surmise this is Yoho apologized. If Yoho had apologized and gone back to work like his coworker, we can surmise that he would not have lost his job. And that's where the judge was coming from, is that going and approaching the owner with the complaints of the kitchen, and then the owner saying to get out, told him not to tell him how to run his effing business, and also the inconsistencies, right, of how that was handled. The judge saw this as an unfair labor practice and a violation of Yoho's rights.
Yeah, I get it and I don't get it. I mean, he still walked off the job. And so what is my right as an employer and a manager if an employee walks off the job?
Yeah, the first thing is to, it depends. A lot of times you're like, okay, they walked off the job. But if there was you're going to have to recognize that if you're going to terminate, let's say, the employees for walking off the job, you're going to have to terminate everybody. If you're going to have a conversation with the employees and you're saying, you can't tell me how to run my business, by presenting these demands or these requests. So there was just I don't know, it's a kind of a fine line there, John, but in this regards, it came down to the judge basically saying, hey, you shot the messenger, so to speak, and you didn't apply discipline consistently across the board. And that was key to him ruling that this was an unfair labor practice.
So, right, it goes back to what we always say when we're teaching employment law: consistency, and documentation. They are going to be your friend. All right, so what happened? What ended up happening in this story?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's no actual monetary penalty. However, the pizzeria had to reinstate Yoho to his former job, including seniority, any other rights or privileges from the past, had to make whole any loss of earnings, benefits as a result of what they called discrimination. That was in the documents, by the way, the result of discrimination against him. They had to remove all references of the termination from his files, notify him in writing that had been done, and that the discharge would never be used against him in any way. And then they had to post at the restaurant facilities notices of all of these actions. So it was quite the spanking.
Yeah, I mean, it is and it's not, right? I mean, again, there's a lot of costs going into this and going back and forth. And you now think about, you have this employee on staff that you really don't want on staff. And I don't know, if I'm Andrew Yoho, am I going to want to stay there? Are things going to change? You have a lot of things going on. So it's interesting. But this is a really amazing story, Chuck. And I'm glad you brought it to us, because I know you and I have these conversations and we talk about the National Labor Relations Act, and we can see the people in our classroom go, yeah, unions, I don't care. But you have to do it. You have to be paying attention. All right, so here's what I got from this. Let me know if I'm missing anything. Number one, listen to your employees if they have concerns about their working conditions. All right, got it? Makes sense. Do not discipline or terminate employees for bringing up working conditions. That's called retaliation. If several employees are talking amongst themselves about working conditions, that is something called protected concerted activities. And we talk a lot about in terms of talking about their salary levels. In this case, it was working conditions, but they have that right to do it.
You got it. You got it.
Okay. Anything else we want to do to wrap this story up?
Yeah. So one thing, just to tie this story to the previously HR in the News story, if these 4 kitchen employees had decided to file cards to say they wanted to join the union, a kitchen union, and they went forward, they could have had an election. That's the crazy thing, John, is they could have had an election, and Frank Battolato could have had himself a union in the company. And that could still very much well happen now. So hopefully if they're listening, I don't know, hopefully I'm not causing or stirring the pot there. But listen, I'm going to go ahead. I
think you're saying you're stirring the pot a little bit. You're like, hey guys, I'm going to be in Pittsburgh. Hey, maybe we should do something. Go ahead. Tell me what's going to happen in the future here.
Yeah, well, I am going to Pittsburgh in a few months, and I might just stop by and see if Andrew Yoho is still working there. In fact, here's another twist of the story. I will tell you something. As a kid, growing up, I knew a kid in my middle school years called Andy Yoho. Andy Yoho lived in Mount Lebanon. He went to school at Mount Lebanon. He was a childhood friend. So I got to wonder if this is that same Andy Yoho or that I knew, or if he's someone related, but my guess is he probably is.
A little personal connection to the pizza place.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I mean, there's so much in this story, and I want to thank you again for bringing this story to us, because I think it's an important lesson, the thing to kind of think about, lots of things. And we're probably going to have a lot of questions coming out of this. So make sure you do email us. Samantha always puts our email in there, in the notes. So go ahead and do that. If you enjoy the HR Stories podcast, please follow. Please like whatever podcast player you're using. Feel free to leave a comment. For those comments really help when we're trying to grow our HR Stories podcast. The more people we can help, more organizations we help, the more we do this, the better it is for us. Stay tuned next week when we will do another listening Q&A. So every other week we take your questions and we answer 3 or 4 of them every week. And so always, I love that segment, because we really kind of get into, Chuck and I approach HR differently, and we talk about the best practices that you should be doing as an HR professional, as a business owner, as a manager, a supervisor, doing that. So kind of pay attention for that. Let us know if you have any questions. We'll be happy to answer them on air. Again, thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story.
Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast. The material presented in this podcast is for informational purposes only. Chuck and John always recommend using an employment lawyer or HR consultant to handle any legal concerns or HR issues. We do our best to double check sources and make sure the information we are providing is accurate. We may eliminate or embellish without changing the basic narrative to make the story easier to understand. In certain circumstances, we may change identifying information to protect the innocent. The HR Stories broadcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories is designed to help anyone with HR responsibilities be better at managing the employee experience. To engage with us, go to the hrstoriesteam.com and learn more about how the team at HR Stories can support your business or nonprofit. Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story.